Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 19, Section 3, The War Winds Down. So let's begin. Roman numeral number 1, Nixon moves to end the war. As his first step towards ending the war, Richard Nixon appointed a man named Henry Kissinger as his special assistant for national security affairs. And eventually, Kissinger becomes the national security advisor to Richard Nixon. Kissinger had been born in Eastern Europe, had left Europe during the time of the Second World War, understood some of the issues surrounding communism in that part of the world. And he seemed to be well groomed to manage this position quite well. Matter of fact, before Nixon leaves office, Kissinger becomes his Secretary of State. Letter B. Vietnamization was the process that Henry Kissinger suggested that would allow for the gradual withdrawal of American troops from South Vietnam, but at the same time, putting the war in the hands of the people who live there, the Vietnamese. And to do this, the United States would keep advisors, military advisors in Vietnam. They would help train the South Vietnamese soldiers and give them support whenever needed. The key here is how quickly we're going to withdraw that help. And initially, we are going to start removing troops kind of starting in the 1970s, and really by 1973, quite a few of our American combat troops have already left Vietnam. Roman numeral number 2, turmoil at home continues. In 1968, an American platoon massacred unarmed South Vietnamese in a hamlet called My Lai, sometimes known as the My Lai Massacre. The man who ordered these troops to go into this village and to shoot women and children as they were looking for VC was a guy named Lieutenant William Calley Jr. He would be court-martialed for his actions in Vietnam. But what's going to end up happening as time kind of goes by, he is going to be released from the brig or the military prison, and he will be allowed to have his freedom again. This makes a lot of people mad, especially the fact that the whole news about the massacre itself really didn't hit the media for about a year to 18 months after the event. And once people found out what had occurred, certainly there were a lot of people that were very vocal about their desire to pull American troops out of the war itself. Not long after that is publicized, we have another event that takes place. And it starts in April of 1970 when President Nixon announces that American troops had invaded Cambodia in an effort to destroy Viet Cong military bases there. We had known that the VC had been using parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that were in part to Laos and Cambodia. But officially in 1970, the United States starts aerial bombing and putting boots on the ground in that part of the world. This again angers a lot of people. And what we're going to see are some mass demonstrations that are going to take place, particularly in college campuses. One of the most famous takes place at Kent State University in May of 1970. And as a result of this event at Kent State, we have a governor that calls out the National Guard in Ohio against these college students who are protesting. And what ends up happening is there's a skirmish. Someone thinks that maybe they've heard shots. Maybe there was a rock thrown at our servicemen. But needless to say, the National Guard opens fire, and 4 students are killed. The student that you see lying there, this again is kind of an iconic, famous photograph of that period of time. But there was actually one student who was actually walking to class, and they just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they got hit by a stray bullet. Not only are you going to see demonstrations at Kent State, Jackson State University, which is down in Jackson, Mississippi, there were a couple students that died in an event there. As a matter of fact, even at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, uh, there were students that went to the ROTC building and set it on fire. Eventually, our governor of Nebraska threatened to call out the National Guard, and this quickly quieted quite a bit of the protests that were happening, at least in our state. Letter D, the publication of something known as the Pentagon Papers also showed how various administrations, going back really beyond the Johnson administration, Kennedy administration, probably Eisenhower and such, tried to convince Congress and the press and the public that the situation in Vietnam was better than it really was. Um, an individual who was kind of close to the White House released these papers. The papers were published by the New York Times, and eventually we're going to have a set of hearings about the publication of this information. Even individuals are going to be named. Um, former Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, is named. Um, personally, for being one of these people who kind of tried to gloss over the situation. Letter E, to force North Vietnam to resume negotiations, the Nixon administration began basically what they call Christmas bombings, or what was known as Operation Linebacker, which was one of the most destructive air raids of the war. It's very comparable to some of the air raids that we saw during the Second World War. We used B-52 bombers. We dropped tons and tons of bombs on Vietnam. But for the most part, not much really changed. President Nixon is going to end up resigning, and some of this is due to other issues that we're eventually going to talk about with the Watergate cover up. But we're going to talk more about that as we get into chapter 21. But as a result of Nixon leaving the White House, we started seeing resistance in Congress, and Congress refused to send funds to aid the South Vietnamese. So between really 1973 and the beginning of 1975, what we're seeing in Vietnam, or at least in South Vietnam, is the gradual encroachment of the North Vietnamese army. And by April of 1975, the North Vietnamese army is literally right outside of the city of Saigon, which is the capital in South Vietnam, located in the southernmost part of the country. And on April 30th, 1975, the North Vietnamese officially captured the city of Saigon. There's a photo here on the left-hand side of the American Embassy, and on top of the American Embassy, there's a helicopter. There were South Vietnamese and Americans, and you name it, anybody who was sympathetic to the United States that was trying to find a way to get out of South Vietnam before the North Vietnamese came in and took over the country. And what's interesting is we were airlifting out as many people as we could. We brought in aircraft carriers for the U.S. Navy, and we were landing helicopters so quickly that at some point in time, there were so many helicopters landing that they could not be refueled before other helicopters landed on these carriers, that literally sailors had to push the helicopters into the South China Sea, which is dumbfounding if you think about it. What ends up happening is after the North Vietnamese capture the city of Saigon, it doesn't necessarily end the war for the Vietnamese. What we're going to see is from 1975 literally to the middle of the 1980s, Vietnam's going to go through a series of civil wars. And there are going to be many people during that 10-year period of time that are going to try to flee. And what we're going to have is a group of people known as boat people, which are basically refugees who are trying to escape that part of the world by sea if they possibly could. The legacy of Vietnam. Some American veterans found it really hard to escape the war's psychological impact because their sacrifices went unrecognized. There are many stories of soldiers who came home from Vietnam only to be yelled at or just be spat upon by other Americans. In many cases, you'll hear stories of soldiers that, as they go to the airport to head home, they try to change into their civilian clothes so that they're not treated poorly by other passengers on airplanes. There are times where some of these soldiers are called baby killers and things of that nature. So it was a very traumatic time for these individuals. Not a lot of respect from the American public, which is really unfortunate and probably has led to a lot of the psychological scars that have happened over the years. In 1982, after a lot of support, the nation finally dedicated the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which is located on the National Mall in Washington. It's black granite, inscribed with the names of those people who were killed or missing in action during the war. This is definitely a living memorial. If you ever go there, it's not uncommon that you will see mementos left there at the wall by family members or by other soldiers in remembrance of their fallen friends. In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which reestablished some of the limits on the executive power. As I mentioned before in class, the War Powers Act, for the most part, requires that the president get permission from Congress before they engage troops overseas for a period of time. If Congress doesn't approve, the president only has a limited window to work with, and usually it's less than 90 days to put troops in and to pull them out. All right. When we talk about kind of the statistics of the war, when we talk about the deaths as far as population, this kind of graphic kind of shows you a little bit about American combat deaths. If you take a look at the white portion of the pie, that's African Americans. The other portion is the rest of the population. If you compare that to the U.S. population, you'll notice that our African American soldiers were probably dying in combat more often than other soldiers. When we look at the death toll, really one of the peak years as far as some of the individuals dying in combat was in 1968. At that point in time, we had kind of a steady rise and literally a steady fall during that period. All right, thank you very much.